I set off on this trip to Scotland from Leeds, and there was a guy on the side of the road about an hour into my journey with a sign saying that he is headed up north towards Glasgow. I've never seen a hitchhiker before and was curious. He was wearing a suit and had a briefcase with him, which looking back was probably kind of odd, but I thought, oh well. I was a confident person, so I pulled over and told him that I was heading up to Scotland and asked him if he would like a ride. He seemed perfectly normal, really handsome anyways, I thought, and offered to give me some money for the ride, so I didn't particularly think that I was in any danger at any time or in any way. I asked him a couple of questions and told him that I was a member of the police department in a kind of jokingly way to see what he would do, or how he would react. But he got in and we set off. He was sitting beside me in front, and everything seemed perfectly normal for the first hour or so. We spoke about normal things, hobbies, interests, family, but we mostly just stayed quiet. About 2 hours in, we stopped for food at this small little village pub. As I get up to get out of the car, he puts his hand on my leg, and at first I'm taken aback because number one, he had been talking about his wife, and number two, you can normally tell when a guy is into you from the get-go, but this wasn't like that at all. Yes, we had been driving, but he was really distant and kind of quiet the entire time, despite the conversations about other things. I looked at him and he looked at me with those type of sex eyes that drives you really crazy. He put his hand further up my thigh, and at that point I pulled him closer to me, and we ended up having sex in the car park of the pub. It was really late at this point, like 11 p.m., so there wasn't really anybody around to see anything. And to be honest, he was the best I ever had looking back on it, but this is where it gets really, really weird. When we'd finished, I asked him if he's ready to go, and he looks at me, smiles, pulls in for another kiss that was really passionate on his part, says thank you, gets out of the car and starts running into the forest, which was behind the car park. I get out of the car and shout and yell out, "What's going on? What the hell are you doing?" But he just leaves. He doesn't look back, he just carries on running into the pitch black forest. At this point I'm so weirded out, like what was going on in the situation. I waited like 10 minutes just in case he came back, but he didn't, and bearing in mind that we had like 2 hours from where I picked him up, it was really, really odd and probably the strangest thing I'd ever seen. But I carried on driving towards Glasgow. I arrived at my mom's house. I go to the boot to get my things, the trunk, and his briefcase is still there. Looking back, I definitely should have taken it to the police, but I didn't really think about doing that at that time. I opened it, and there was a packet of Maltese and some underpants and a t-shirt and an envelope. The name on the envelope was none other than my name. My whole name. First and last. But how? How did he know my name? We never met each other before this. I told him my first name, but not my second, and I was pretty much awestruck when I saw it. He never wrote anything down in the car. He never got out of the car to go to the boot. Then inside the letter there was 5 50-pound notes and a tiny piece of paper saying, "Buy something pretty." That's really the end of that. I never saw him again after that. This was 5 years ago, and I still can't explain it at all. Somebody please help. And oh yes, I forgot, he said his name was Herbert. Any Herberts out there want to fess up to what they did? My dad and I watched people disappear behind a tree line. Last night, my dad and I were out on our porch, and I was going out every once in a while beyond the porch to ride my skateboard around the street when I wanted to. I ended up going back to my porch to sit down and chat with my dad again. We didn't talk about anything important, but not long after that we heard a group of kids walking around. About 30 seconds later they emerged from behind our neighbor's house. They were still on the sidewalk though. They walked on the sidewalk and turned and went onto the sidewalk where my house was. They asked us if we had seen a pit bull, but we hadn't seen a dog at all, so we just simply said no. They continued down the sidewalk and ended up getting close to the corner of the sidewalk. The corner of the sidewalk was blocked by a tree. I watched as the group had all been covered by the tree. I waited about 10 seconds later, and they had not left that corner. My attention to the tree was cut short as I heard the footsteps of two boys also walking. They seemed to be following the trail of the other group. They got to the end of the sidewalk and walked behind the same tree. Sure enough, they hadn't come out behind the tree either. I grabbed my skateboard and rode to the other end of the road to get a look at that corner of the road. I quickly went back to my porch and asked my dad if he had seen the same thing too. And he quickly said yes. Mid-conversation, I ran back down and I followed the sidewalk on the other side of the road to see if there was anybody still there. However, they were all gone. The other night I went and watched a show with my sister. I took my little Louis Vuitton pouchette-style purse, which is pretty tiny and only holds my phone, wallet, and keys, although I always try and jam my asthma puffer in there as well. Because of the severity of my condition, I need to carry medication on me at all times. Doing so causes my purse not to clasp because the puffer is bulky. So I tell you now that jamming even one puffer is already pushing the limit to this little purse. So in the Uber on the way to the show, we took a sharp turn and my items fell out of my purse. I felt around the seat and popped everything back in. When we arrived at the show, I thanked the Uber driver and he left. So then my sister and I were waiting in line to head into the theater, and the Uber driver comes back 2 minutes later to where I was in line. He put his window down and handed me a puffer and said, "You dropped this." I thanked him and then realized that I had already had my puffer back in my purse. I compared them and they had the same batch number and the same old Ventolin design without the new design feature of the number of remaining doses left on the back, which is how the newer models come now. I only have one older model puffer left, which is the one that I packed. The rest have this new feature. This scenario blows my mind. I know there's crazy glitches going on as people are reporting other things duplicating, but this one is just downright weird for me. This happened a few months ago. My husband had been working remotely from home since beginning the viral lockdown. We live in this old farmhouse, and the front door and side door are both located in the kitchen. To get in and out of the house, you have to walk through both the kitchen and living room. I woke up one morning, made a cup of coffee, and sat on the edge of the couch to watch the news and weather. My husband walks out of our bedroom, passes me in the living room, and into the kitchen. He turns to tell me that he's going to set the trash out by the curb for pickup. He walks outside to take out the trash. About a half hour goes by, and I have been sitting in the same spot, waiting for him to return because I wanted to ask him about the new app for our dog's veterinarian. I realize a half hour might seem like a while to wait for him to come back in from taking out the trash, but we have an acreage, so it's not unlike him to get distracted by something else outside, or play fetch with the dog for a little bit while he's out there. I decide to call him on the phone to see when he's going to come back inside. He answers and says he is already in his office working, which is weird because he would have had to walk directly past me again to get into his office from being outside. So he definitely did not do that. I walked back to his office and there he was typing away on his computer. He asked me where I had gone and says that I was in the living room where I had been sitting drinking my coffee the entire time when he came back in from taking the trash out. I'd gone over this probably a million times in my head and there's no explanation for what happened other than some kind of a glitch or something similar to that. This happened 5 days ago while we were on our way home from a friend's house. My friend lives in my hometown, which is approximately 45 minutes from where we currently live and work. I used to commute from my hometown to where we live now 5 or 6 days a week for 7 years. The point being that I'm incredibly familiar with the highway route and have driven the route during all times of the day and in all types of conditions. I literally know it like the back of my hand. So after a long day of hanging out at a friend's house, we started heading back home at around 1:30 a.m. After 15 miles, we hopped on the highway, which we will be on for another roughly 15 miles before we merge onto another highway that heads south into our home city. All is going well, and I remember seeing mile marker 94, which means I have about 9 more miles before I have to merge onto the next highway. Suddenly we hit some construction and the highway is reduced to 1 lane. No big deal, they do construction on this highway every summer. Within what feels like a mile or two, I start getting a bit confused because the highway is feeling very unfamiliar to me. I figured it's just from the construction and I just keep driving on. A few more minutes go by and at this point I'm feeling really unsettled and even more confused. Nothing looks familiar to me anymore. The road, the buildings, the landscape, etc. I shrug it off because I know my next exit is going to merge onto the next highway, and it should be coming in a few more minutes. Only, it doesn't. We start exiting the construction zone. I'm totally lost and I see signs telling me that I'm on a different highway altogether heading towards a different city. My girlfriend is equally confused and pulls up the GPS on her phone, which only confirms that we're not where we should be. We use the GPS to go back and somehow manage to get home in exactly 45 minutes, and that's how long it usually takes. She went to bed, but I stayed up a bit because I was so confused as to what happened and how we ended up driving so far out of our way without realizing it. I studied Google Maps a bit and determined that in the 5 or 10 minutes we somehow wound up 16 miles off course, which seems impossible unless I was going very fast. The problem there was that I actually was going 60 miles per hour because I was in a construction zone. The other problem is that if we had driven so far out of the way, how did we get home on time? Thirdly, even if I would have missed my exit, I would have known where I was for at least several more miles because there were more exits that I've taken before for alternate routes. I have no recollection of passing any of them though. I went and redrove the route the next day. I figured that there must have been a weird detour or something. However, when I retraced the routes, there was no construction at all. This was Memorial Day weekend here in the United States. I highly doubt that they would have finished the job and took down everything on a holiday weekend. I hope this makes sense. It's hard for me to describe it further in detail without showing a map of where this actually happened. I'm completely stumped, and so is my girlfriend. I know this isn't the craziest story or anything, but not being able to rationalize what happened that night will bother me for the rest of my life. I live in a small town surrounded by other small towns and 2 large cities that are 2+ hours away. My mother and I would always go to the doctor's appointments a town over. We have small towns in close proximity, but this one is an hour and a half away and there are no towns in between. Only desert and oil field sites. Usually we would leave the house 2 hours before our appointment, and then we would go grab Starbucks since our appointments were all early in the morning. It was just a little tradition that we had. Anyways, we'd been going back and forth for weekly and bi-weekly appointments for about a year at this point. We had an appointment at 9 a.m., so that meant at 7 a.m. we needed to be in the car leaving the house. We got a late start and didn't end up leaving until around 8 a.m., which only gave us an hour to get there. We had to stop to get some gas or something like that, and we didn't end up getting Starbucks, we just headed down on the road. We were speeding but not going crazy fast because sometimes there are state troopers or traffic cops. We always listen to music on our way up there. We turn the music up pretty loud and probably terribly sing our hearts out. This time was no different, however. It was stranger because we hit a random dead zone with no service, and that had never happened before and hasn't happened since. With the silence from there being no music, we talked about calling the office and telling them that we were going to be late for our appointment when all of a sudden the car just goes dark. All the lights on the dashboard just simply are not lit up anymore, and then it stays at low fuel, even though filling up the car was part of why we were so late in the first place. We didn't say anything, we just both looked at each other with confusion. I didn't say much when the dash lights came back on. The music followed shortly after, and then the entrance to the town was right up ahead of us. We arrived in what felt like 30 minutes, and we didn't really remember much of the drive at all. Like, pretty much nothing. I looked down at my phone to see the time was only 7 a.m., and I couldn't believe it. We hadn't left until 8 a.m. We checked our phone, and it was 7 a.m. The time in the car said 7 a.m. I called my dad, and it was in fact 7 a.m. There's no possible way we left at 5:30 in the morning because it would have still been dark outside, or at least fairly dark, where I live anyways. I would also like to note that our vehicle clock does not change time when we travel, even across multiple time zones. There is no time zone change between the towns we were going to, and even at that, we both had our phones and we were checking the time a lot, at first debating if we were going to make it or not. The gas was also back to almost completely full, even though we usually use a lot more gas when we travel from town to town because of how long it takes. The car was also pretty much brand new, and there was never any issue, either in the past or in the present, with reading the capacity or the gas gauge. We acknowledged how weird it was and then spent the time we had getting food and going to a few stores that were open. We went to our appointment when it was time, and then we went home. I brought up this story to her last week to see if she remembered the same thing, and she does. I still can't come up with a logical explanation no matter how much I think about it. I was laying in bed the other day reflecting on some old memories and thinking about how if X didn't happen, Y surely would not have happened either. I know this sounds weird, but I've been alone with my thoughts lately, and I've had a lot of time to think about all of this and reflect on different things. I started reliving a very strong and bad childhood memory, but for some reason this time, I imagined my current self being there to protect my younger self from what was happening. Then I drifted off to sleep thinking about how my life may have been different based off of that one moment changing. Sometime later, I shot straight up in my bed from a dead sleep in a panic attack with a sense of feeling that I didn't lock the door for some reason. I jumped out of bed and sprinted to my door, and sure enough I saw that the door wasn't locked. Unfortunately, as I just got there, a man started opening the door and tried walking inside. I pushed the door shut, hard as I could, pushing him out, and I quickly locked it, deadbolting it. I wanted to make sure that this guy would not try to force his way back in. As I was pushing him out, we made direct eye contact. He was older. He was maybe in his late 50s. Tan with a black mustache, a bald head with salt and pepper hair on the sides of his head, sticking out kind of messy in a way, and he was wearing a red sweater. He had these small glasses that were pushed down to the edge of his nose, and he had a brown paper bag filled with groceries in his arm. I can still see the expression of shock on his face as I pushed him out of the door. As I leaned back, still shaking in panic against the door, I suddenly woke up in bed again, so confused. It was so weird. Less like a dream and more like I woke up from an alternate reality where I don't live in my apartment, I live in somebody else's. I know this is probably suspicious that I'm on a new account and posting this here, but I made this new Reddit account specifically to tell this story. So, okay, I think it's important to provide some backstory. I live in a small town in the middle of nowhere. It's in a forested area in the United States. I'm 32 years old, and I'm a male and I hunt regularly. I will not provide my state for privacy reasons, so a few days ago I decided to go deep into the forest and I saw a huge deer. I decided that I was going to hunt this deer, so I readied my rifle and the deer got startled by what I can only describe as an ear-piercing shriek. I had had previous encounters with the Wendigo, but that's not what this was. The shriek was more like when you scratched metal or nails on a chalkboard, as well as a burning sound. As I looked for the sound, I found nothing except for a small fire on a tree. I put out the fire, and by the time I got out where my town was, everything was completely different, and everything had changed from small log cabins to big concrete structures. The cabins that people lived in were in the same place, but the larger buildings were totally different. And I forgot to mention that the whole walk back home I was catching a glimpse of a shadowy figure that was stalking me through the trees, as well as the forest being completely quiet without any kind of a sound at all. I'll give you an update if things changed back to the way that they were. Okay, here goes. I hope somebody has an answer or can point me into the right direction, or to somebody who does have an answer. I'm an 18-year-old male from Virginia, and a few days ago I was in my bedroom in the middle of the day. I can't remember much before the incident, but I know that I was awake because I wrote it down on my phone as soon as it ended. I got a headache and I heard this weird electrical buzzing noise. The noise isn't anything new. I've heard tones and buzzes since about the 5th or 6th grade. Seems few other people notice them, but I do. Anyways, I started blinking fast and then I felt this extreme nausea. That's when I realized what I was looking at. It was my room, but it was extremely different. Everything looked old, moldy, and almost colorless. There were these weird root things that were all over the floors and the walls. Then I smelled this massive stench. I then ran into the living room to see my father and younger brother. At least what I thought was my father and younger brother. They looked slightly grayish blue, but they were skin and bones totally. And they were eating this really nasty block of what I can only guess was decaying meat. The world didn't get a light from the sky, but it was as if each piece of dust and air gave off its own small amount of light. It's hard to describe. Then I noticed this creature staring at me, and only me. It looked like it was made of shadows, but it was like the shadows were a puddle of liquid that floated in the air. I went back to our normal reality, and I was in my room again, standing straight up sweating. Since then I've gotten a few 1 to 2 second glimpses of this other reality, but that's about it. A minute ago my sister asked me if I remembered something really strange that happened 10 years ago. It was 3 a.m. and the year was 2004, and I was 11 years old or so, and my cousin was about 12, and my sister was 16 and her ex-boyfriend was 18. We lived in Singapore where it's really safe at night. We were taking a long walk at night, but we didn't want our parents to know what we were up to. Being young kids walking around at night, even in a really safe city like Singapore, we might tend to get into some trouble, and we wouldn't want our parents to know about any of that. But anyways, as we were walking, we saw a playground with multiple levels that you could climb on, and we initially wanted to go there to just hang out for a bit, but then we saw a group of maybe 3 to 4 adults, or perhaps they were just older looking teenagers, but anyways, they were already hanging out on that playground. We can hear the chatter, and we can see them standing on it, and we were about 40 to 50 meters away. We then decided to proceed to another plot to chill, and we continued to walk past the playground, but as we were approaching about 5 meters away from it, the people that we had just seen dissolved into thin air. They just disappeared into nothing. It was slow and gradual dissolving. It then became completely silent too. The sound of chatter was gone. We were around the playground and found nothing but trash all over the place, and that's about it. It wasn't spooky, it was just very, very strange. It didn't seem to make any sense at all. It couldn't have been a mirage either. All of us saw it, and we were fully expecting to see people when we got closer, but when we did, nothing was there. Like I mentioned, that group of people, they just dissolved into nothing. They seemed to be human to us. Nothing spooky about them, and we saw them from a distance. They seemed to be just like anybody else, hanging out, minding their business, and just enjoying the night. But what happened to them? Were they abducted by aliens? Were they erased from the earth? Or did they go to another dimension? As I mentioned earlier, I wasn't scared at all, but because of what happened and the circumstances, it still stands out to me all this time later. The day that our dimension resets. I know the title sounds funny, but that's pretty much the only way that I can explain this experience. Well, one day when I was a teenager, I was at my best friend's brother's trailer. We were just hanging out playing video games when we heard a knock on the door. So I got up to answer it, and it was 2 of our other friends that we always hung out with all the time. They asked us if we wanted to go with them to get a bag of something. My friend was busy playing video games and I was a little bit restless, so I decided to go with them. Everything sounds pretty normal, right? Okay, so we set off on our way to find our local dealer. This was way before legalization, so there were no dispensaries. Plus, we were young, we were teenagers. So we get about 30 feet down the road, and all of a sudden I noticed something really strange. I noticed that the stop sign is gone, but it's not like it wasn't there. You can still basically see it, but instead of a sign, it was just a plain blank one. All white, kind of like the background that you're reading this on. This really disturbed me, and my friends just walked right past it like it was the most normal thing in the world. I stopped, because it completely freaked me out, and pointed it out and said, "Hey, the stop sign is gone." They looked at it and just turned at me, and one of them said, "Stop sign? What's a stop sign?" I forgot who said it, it was a long time ago, but it was like he had never heard of a stop sign in his entire life. My other friend was just looking at me confused, probably trying to figure out what a stop sign was, I guess. It was at that time that I started to think to myself what a stop sign was, but I didn't have a clue, so I just shrugged it off and just kept walking. The blank space where that stop sign was supposed to be, for some reason, just all of a sudden felt like the most natural thing in the world. We take about 10 more steps, and then I realize that the cars in the trailer park are now blank too. I start feeling really scared, and my friend didn't even notice anything. So I yelled, "Hey, now the cars are gone." And one of them looked at me confused again and said, "Car?" At this point, I really started to go nuts, and I knew that something horrible was going on. I tried to think of what a car was at that moment, as stupid as it sounds, but nothing was coming up. Not only were things disappearing in reality, but my memory of what these objects were disappearing from my memory as well. I just stood there looking around, making sure nothing else was going to disappear, but it didn't seem to matter, I guess. Things were disappearing before my eyes, and there was nothing that I could do about it. And along with objects went my memories. Trailers were gone, trees were gone, the road we were standing on was disappearing and finally gone. Even my own body was disappearing, and the next thing I knew I was floating into nothing. I remember this very clearly, even though my brain should not have been able to function because of what was happening. I do remember it, because I didn't exist anymore, right? I wasn't exactly floating, it was more like I was stuck in this white mass. There wasn't pressure, but I could feel it, if that makes any sense. It felt like mud that was just a little bit colder than lukewarm. It was very uncomfortable. I really had a hard time thinking about this predicament, even though I could feel everything. I had no emotions besides feeling uncomfortable, and this lasted for an eternity. I'm serious. It felt like I was stuck like that for 1,000,000 years, and there was nothing that I could do about it. And then at one point, I just didn't care. When I think back on it, I still get really scared about it, but something happened that day that makes me feel like I should have shared this with somebody much earlier. And well, after an eternity of nothing, then bam, all of a sudden I was sitting on my friend's couch, the one that I was visiting that I mentioned earlier, watching him play World of Warcraft. I loathe that game entirely. I would never sit and watch that game ever. My friends who also showed up earlier were sitting there on the floor, which I thought was pretty strange because we could have all easily fit on the couch, but anyways. I stood up and yelled out, "What in the heck just happened?" And they all looked at me pretty startled and asked me what I was talking about. I explained what I just experienced, and they had no memory of what happened. I kept saying it over and over in detail, trying to get them to remember. Then one of them said, "Oh yeah, I thought that was just a dream." And then my other friend jumped up and said, "What's going on here?" I remember that. But to them it was like a memory from long ago. It was like a dream to them. I was the only one who remembered the whole thing in complete detail, but I'm still glad that I wasn't the only one that remembered something. Even though the memory was pretty vague, it makes me feel like I'm not crazy. This happened in Fairbanks, Alaska in the summer of 2012. I will never forget this experience. It was the most screwed up day of my entire life. I really hope that this never happens again. It has made me question reality, my mental health, everything. I'm wondering sometimes if I had a stroke or a seizure, or maybe something similar to that. And this is a true story that was told to me by one of my relatives. To my relative, if you're reading this, I apologize if you didn't want this story to be shared, but I want more people to know about this type of event. You know those stories about people getting stuck in one place, just walking in circles? These events usually take place in a forest where it's quite easy to get lost. So you question the legitimacy of those stories. Anybody could end up walking in circles in a forest, right? But this one is unquestionably legit. It took place in a very populated urban area, and two people witnessed the same event. This relative of mine was going on a vacation to India with one of her friends. As an enthusiast of spirituality, she suggested that they should go witness a water burial by the side of a river. So the both of them ended up going to a river where people performed water burials that was very close to the hotel that she was staying at. Basically, they watched people perform these water burials. As they watched these bodies being handled, her friend said that she cringed from seeing the legs move around as if those bodies were still alive. Eventually, they decided to leave. Then, they realized that something was not right. The skies were sunny beforehand, but all of a sudden, the skies became overcast and everything became relatively dark. My relative and her friend both witnessed this. They were trying to get back to the hotel, but they found out that there was a problem. Even though they kept walking in one direction, they still ended up at the same place they were before. They ended up back at the river. Both of them were extremely confused and scared at this point because it was impossible for them to walk in circles. The hotel was extremely close. There was no reason for them to not be able to find their way back. So they tried to walk back again and again and again from the river, but they ended up just going back to the river. They also realized that there was something peculiar about their surroundings. Not only did the weather drastically change, the large road signs on the side of the road were gone. Also, there were lots of people walking around the area before this all happened. Now, more than half of the people were gone, and there were children playing soccer around the area. It felt like they walked in circles for 3 hours. After those 3 hours, the weather was back to normal, and everything was back. The road signs were visible again, and the children that were playing soccer earlier were gone. And one more important detail. As soon as they decided to leave, the weather and population density really changed. I'm not sure how in sync this was or when they noticed a population change, but the weather was the first thing that they noticed the moment they decided to depart. But at that moment, when everything got back to normal, the weather and the population density reverted back to normal at the exact same time, pretty much in sync. The two of them looked at each other and said nothing. They just ran back to the hotel as fast as they could.